Okay, sure. Yeah. Thank you very much, Adrian. It's wonderful to be here. And I got an extra special surprise last night checking into my accommodation. I noticed that there was a DVD beside the TV set called Waking Ned. And I don't know if it was deliberate, but it seemed like an extra nice touch, an extra nice welcome to the island, because that's what I feel. I feel that everybody in this room might be wanting to do. It's quite an honour to be delivering the Ned Maddrell Memorial Lecture, because his name first came to my attention long ago. I think it probably was in the Guinness Book of Records. His claim to fame being, of course, that he was the last native-born speaker of Manx. And I was captivated even then, probably at the time when he was still alive. I think he was in the Guinness Book of Records. The thought of that solitary man being the repository of so much history and with no one to share it with. But now, in the short time that I've been on this island, I realise that that situation is being reversed, and that if Ned Maddrell were alive today, he would really have people to share his linguistic heritage with, and it's a wonderful thing to be able to have that confirmed. I'm going to assume that you know something about the world's disappearing linguistic cultures, but I'm also going to assume that, like me, you've got a first-hand knowledge of only a tiny sliver of them. It's a vast field. So, as Adrian said, my name's Chris Moseley. I teach Latvian at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at University College in London. Latvian is not an endangered language nowadays, but there was a time, not so long ago, when it was thought to be. Back in the last days of the Soviet Union. And in fact, I came to be interested in Latvian largely through my study of a really endangered language, Livonian, spoken on the western coast of Latvia, a Finno-Ugrian, a Baltic Finnic language, spoken as a first language until just a generation ago by a few people on the coast of Latvia, and already extinct as the most recent language to die in Europe, in the sense that its last speaker, an elderly man, the last speaker born into a family speaking it, died just 2 years ago. But it's still hanging on as a revived language. The same thing we can say about Manx, depending on which criteria you want to use. And just like Manx, it was a fishing community that kept the Livonian language alive, long after the more land-based communities had melted into the surrounding majority, in their case the Latvian majority. So I'm seeing more and more parallels with the Manx situation the more I come to know about Manx, the more fascinating it becomes. And by telling you this, I'm coming straight to the nub of some of the central problems I've come across in editing this third edition of the atlas I'm going to tell you about today. Adrian explained that we don't have access to what he's homed in on here. It's not responding, but I'm sure it will if you have access to the internet and a computer and you want to try yourselves. The main thing to know is you go to www.unesco.org/culture and follow the links from there, and you can try it out at home. Rather than us fiddling around looking for it now, it normally works. We just don't have access to it right now. Not to worry though. I'm not relying on it completely, because what we have here beside me is the wall map that comes with the printed version of the atlas. This is what the English edition of the third edition looks like, and in it comes this wall map, where each language is, each endangered language in the world is shown by a little single symbol. I'll explain that in this lecture as I go along, what the method is of showing them. This UNESCO Atlas, this third edition, grew out of the concept of the Red Book. Some of you might have heard of the Red Book. which was originally meant to provide a worldwide alert to the loss of biological diversity. By the early 1990s, linguists and anthropologists were beginning to notice a parallel between the losses sustained by nature and the losses sustained by human culture. And being an organisation concerned with both science and culture, it naturally fell to the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation, just let me remind you what those initials stand for, to take up the call to safeguard cultural as well as biological diversity. The first two editions of this atlas, in 1996 and 2001, were issued in book form with an accompanying set of maps, but they didn't cover the whole world. They only aimed to provide data about some representative snapshot areas of the world where the threat to the smaller indigenous languages was most acute. In the first edition, published in 1996, under the general editorship of Stephen Wurm, the late Stephen Wurm, professor at the Australian National University, listed 600 languages which were considered endangered. And there were 53 pages of text and 12 maps. The second edition, 2001, was also edited by Professor Wurm, completed just before he died. For both of these editions, he gathered around him an international team of experts who described the regional situations in texts to accompany each map and plotted the positions of the endangered languages using a colour-coded system which we're still using, even in this edition, basically, and I'll explain it shortly. In that second edition, the number of languages listed was increased to 800 from 600, and there were 90 pages of text and 14 maps. But it was still not complete and comprehensive. I remember, for instance, that whole parts of India were missing. It was just a set of snapshots about what were considered the most complex clusters of endangered languages, languages that were likely to disappear. So thanks to some generous funding from the government of Norway, it was possible to expand the project in several ways for this edition. Firstly, it's appearing for the first time in two forms. This digital online version that you see here on the screen, launched in Paris in February 2009 to coincide with International Mother Tongue Day, the 22nd of February every year, and no, 24th of February, 21st. The print version appeared a year later, as well as the printed Spanish and French versions. So for the first time, we'd had it translated. One important advantage is that now it's accessible to all users. Any faults or errors of omission or commission can be rectified in the future as an ongoing process. The scope of the atlas is now greatly extended to include 2,500 languages, so it's quite a leap forward in the number of languages covered. Probably more than a third of all the languages in the world, if we assume that there were the figure of 6,500, about 6,700 languages in the world is often quoted. So that would be more than a third. Since the languages are constantly dying at the rate of at least one every few weeks, naturally we had to decide to include some recently extinct ones among these. So approximately 230 of the languages included have been extinct since 1950. That's a sort of rule of thumb, the lifetime of UNESCO, or 2 generations of language losers. The mapping itself has changed profoundly since the last edition. That's another big change. Previously, the printed maps were simply flat outline maps in a single colour, drawn to the appropriate scale for the region being shown, but with no topographical detail and few indicators of towns or other landmarks. The new maps are based on Google technology. Now the individual maps that you'll see online are slightly different in appearance to these, because these are still rather flat. You don't see much topographic detail there, but you would see more if you go online. But it's based on Google technology. It's not overloaded with geographical detail because it's important not to distract the user from seeking the location of a language. That's why you're using it, presumably. But the amount of topographical detail, the opportunity to zoom in and out of different scales all help the user to easily get their bearings. So if you look at a typical page of the atlas and select it by clicking on its symbol, you'll see the amount of data that is available about each individual language. We can't do that now on screen, but I can still show you one individual page from the printed version. There's a map of northern South America, for instance. That's the kind of amount of detail you get. Now, if you click on any one of these online, any one of these little symbols that you see here, each symbol being one language, you'll see a little pop-up tab that appears with its main name, its alternative names, if any, its ISO code, and let me pause here and explain what the ISO 639 code is. It's a single three-letter code assigned to each language in the world that's recognized as a separate language. I can't remember the symbol for Manx, the three-letter codes for Manx offhand. I should have checked it just before I came in, but there is one anyway. Probably begins with M. It'll be related to the name of the language. Now, when I say recognized as a separate language, that's an important criterion here, because on the one hand, one language may have many names, which might also refer to dialects of it. And on the other hand, several languages might share one name. I can think of an example. There's 3 languages in the world called Tonga. They're not related to each other, Tonga or Tongan. They're spoken in widely different parts of the world. It could get confusing if you just happen to be looking them up, but if you know the code, that makes it narrows it down a bit. Yeah, so these codes will distinguish the separate identity of each language. These codes were not invented by us. That's why I say ISO codes. They're actually the property of the International Standards Organization, something quite independent of UNESCO or anything else. But they're most often associated with the ethnologue listing of the world's known languages. I don't know if you're all familiar with ethnologue. It's a publication that's been coming out since 1951, every few years, every couple of years, brought up to date, published by the Summer Institute of Linguistics in America. And their job is really to be a bit like the Mormon Church of languages in a way. In other words, to account for every single one, every single language on earth, and no matter how much they're split up into subdivisions. Ethnologue lists all the world's known languages, and so it obviously needs to make great use of these codes, and they are advisors to the International Standards Organization. But now we, who are working on this atlas, are also advisors to them. And we make recommendations about changing codes for languages which have been wrongly subdivided, we feel. And we feel that there's proof that they've been wrongly assigned codes. As well, of course, the other detail you get on the tab will be geographical coordinates, you know, latitude and longitude. And the numbers of speakers, of course, you'd want to know that if you're looking up a language. And you'd want to know the relevant policies and projects that might give you an idea about the future for that language, what threats exist to it. What it does not show is affiliation within a language family. We don't try to, in that little tab, analyze how it's related to other languages. We do have that information, but we feel that it's best explained in the text, as in some cases it may involve quite complex hierarchies that can't easily be shown in a confined space. I think it would be more trouble than it's worth to try and pinpoint the position of a language in a hierarchy. Think of Manx, for instance, within the Celtic group, and the Celtic group within a larger hierarchy. It could get quite complex. And of course, what is very important is that users have a chance to give their feedback. Some of this feedback will lead to changes in the information provided about the languages in the atlas. So, for this project, the world was divided up into regions, more or less continental in scope, and the editors for each section worked on the maps and provided the text. The project had a web editor in Paris at UNESCO headquarters who allowed password access to each of the editors to plot the position of each language on their own map and provide the accompanying information. And the languages were then indexed and grouped by country in alphabetical order so that the user can scroll up and down a list for each country to locate a particular language. You'd be able to see that on the screen, well, you will be able to if you try it online. Alternatively, in the printed version, we have an index, an alphabetical index at the back of every language, and the map that it refers to, the map number. So this information was checked against ISO codes, and in some cases our regional experts had to disagree with the codes given, either because they applied too widely to a group of separate languages or too narrowly to misidentified languages or dialects. So we're also contributing corrections to the official code list of the International Standards Organization. I wouldn't say we're making revolutionary changes to it, because broadly speaking we agree with it. It's a pretty much tried and tested set of formulae, but there are some little adjustments that we editors find need making. New codes are needed in some cases, and some old codes need to be reassigned or dropped. Another important point about mapping the languages in this atlas is that the languages are shown by points, not by polygons. You can see that here even from where you're sitting. A single point for each language, which can only be a vague representation. Each language point is of a single standard size. The reason is obvious. Very small points could easily be lost. Very large points, measured by the number of speakers, would crowd out the smaller points. It wouldn't work in providing a map. So from the point of view of the size of the point, every language is equal. Also, since we're not mapping stable or unthreatened languages at all the blank spaces there, we can't use polygons. By polygons, I mean shapes representing the actual area where a language is spoken, because they would border onto nothing, wouldn't they? They would raise more questions they would answer. So therefore, we faced the challenge of placing the standard point in the most central location for each language. If the speakers are scattered over a wide area, look at Siberia here, and think of the nomadic peoples who live in some parts of northern Siberia here. That's a bit of a problem from a mapping point of view. If they're scattered over a wide area, this represents a further problem, and if there are other languages in between, naturally we do have to use several points. But we've tried to be sparing with these, and such a policy has to be applied judiciously if the speakers are nomadic, for instance. In such a case, all we can do is provide a minimum number of representative points to give you a broad outline of where the area a language might conceivably cover. So you'll see the difference between mapping methods if you compare a page of this UNESCO atlas with a page from an atlas that I was also involved with before this one, the Routledge Atlas of the World's Languages. Now that uses polygons. It treats all languages equally, and the only blank spaces show uninhabited places. For illustration, I can hold up some examples here. Here's the same area covered in different maps. I can pass these around as I talk if you like, but before I do pass them around, I'll just explain. This is more or less as close as I could get, although the scales are different. Here is our representation of the northern part of South America as you see it in the printed version of the atlas. This is a page taken from the printed version here with the equal-sized points. Now, some of that area is uninhabited. It's jungle. From this map, you just have to guess. What's most important is pinpointing the position of the languages and seeing from the color code how endangered they are. I'll explain the codes in just a little while. Now here is the same part of northern South America shown in two different ways in the Routledge Atlas of the World Languages. Here is the contemporary situation as the world looks in 2011. This is all languages. So we have vast uninhabited areas that are just white. And the area where languages are spoken is clearly shrunken from this position, which is what we call the time of contact. Time of contact is when the conquistadors arrived, in this case, the early 15th century, early 16th century, late 15th century. This is how the world is thought to have looked, how that part of South America is thought to have looked. And each language is color-coded by its genetic relationship. So here you can see part of a key where all the languages that are shaded green are related to each other, and they're listed here. They're given numbers. This is in the Routledge Atlas. They're given numbers. They're given the same sets of numbers here in the contemporary map. So you can see here's sort of an illustration of endangerment taken from an atlas which shows all the languages of the world equally. I'll just pass that round. I'll get you to pass it around, Adrian. Thanks. If you want to have a closer look as I explain a bit further. So the points themselves are in a range of colours. The colours indicate the degree of endangerment when we're talking about here, whereas in the Atlas of the World's Languages, colours are used to indicate genetic relationship. Let me explain now how we use colour by pointing out the codes here at the bottom of this world map, this wall map here. If a language is coloured white, that means it's vulnerable. In other words, it's, let me give you the definition. If most children or families of a particular community speak their parental language as a first language, even if only in the home, we use this rather sparingly. You won't find all that many languages that are coloured white. Definitely endangered, which is here, this yellow colour. That is if the language is no longer learned as the mother tongue or taught in the home. The youngest speakers would be of the parental generation. The youngest speakers would be. And then we move to this orange colour here, which I hope you can see, severely endangered. What we mean by severely endangered is if the language is spoken only by grandparents and older generations. The parent generation may still understand, but it won't pass it on to their children. And then we find critically endangered, which is this dark red danger signal. It's, if the youngest speakers are the great-grandparents' generation, so, you know, not likely to be living now, and the language is not used every day. These older people may only partially remember it and have no partners for communication. That's the UNESCO definition. And then we have extinct, the black mark here. If no one speaks or remembers the language, we editors decided to include such languages if they've been spoken in the past 60 years, approximately the lifetime of UNESCO itself. Of all the categories, we found this is the most controversial. And I think you people in this room are aware of some of the controversy, because you are the champions of a language which is, has been accused of being extinct. But that only goes to show that we, editors at UNESCO, hadn't finely tuned our criteria enough. So I want to apologise to you now if you took offence at that. I'll go into a little bit more detail about our reasoning here now. What you don't find on the map at all are, of course, other criteria. And I could say there are two other criteria which are irrelevant to this map. And they are safe. That's if the language is spoken by all generations. The intergenerational transmission of the language is uninterrupted. So therefore, we don't put it in. Standard German, for instance, or Standard English, obviously, would be clear examples of a safe language. And the other category that we don't bother with is stable yet threatened. If a language is spoken in most contexts by all generations with unbroken transmission, although multilingualism in the native language and one or more dominant languages has taken over in certain contexts. Now that all sounds a bit complicated, but I think you know what I mean in terms of daily use of a language. They're not usually in the atlas, but potentially they will be in the future. There may be languages that are going to head that way, heading towards inclusion in the atlas in future editions. And that's what we've got to look out for. We specialists have got to look out for, monitor their situation. It can happen in our own lifetime, easily. So for this third edition, which first appeared in 2009, not only was the printed version expanded to cover the entire world, as you see from that map there, which we couldn't have done with previous editions, but UNESCO created this online version so that any user with access to a computer can look at the language situation in a particular country, or search for a particular language, or a particular class of languages as they wish. Not only that, but users have the opportunity to provide feedback to the editors, and you'll see that if you play around with it. You'll see that your comment is invited. If you disagree with the information you find yourself confronted with, and you've got evidence to the contrary, then you find some data that's wrong. Oh, okay. Or some important language is omitted. Since this latest edition appeared, my team of editors have been receiving a steady stream of comments and queries and suggestions from users. And that's where we come to all the controversies we've had with this edition. Now, the phase of work that the Atlas is now engaged in, it's interesting and challenging. UNESCO has commissioned the Foundation for Endangered Languages, which I'm also involved with, to monitor and process the feedback from users of the online edition. The feedback's been submitted continuously for over 2 years now, since publication, in other words, since the launch of the online version. And the submissions have now settled down to a steady tick over after an initial flourish of curiosity and enthusiasm. The work of checking the accuracy of the claims and the counterclaims for possible amendments to the Atlas is quite rigorous, and so it has to be slow and painstaking. The Foundation has had to employ a part-time assistant, in fact, to deal with the backlog, both last year and this year. And the suggestions, these are the kinds of suggestions we get. Location of the markers. A marker might be in a not central enough position, for instance, for a language. The status on the endangerment scale. In other words, it might be the wrong colour in the view of somebody who reckons they have evidence to the contrary. We're always prepared to stand corrected. Population figures might be out of date. The speaker numbers. A very common problem with the ethnologue, for instance, is getting reliable figures, relying too much on a census, a national census of a country, which can often distort numbers of speakers, for the simple, innocent reason that the way a question is phrased in a census form about what you speak at home. There are ways of asking that question that might give you end up with a false statistic about the number of actual speakers. Classification as a language. Well, that's a controversy. As I said, it's not a controversy that we enter into in the tabs, but I don't mean classification within a language family, but rather as a language at all. Some people have a strong opinion about what's a language and what's a dialect. Now, we could talk all afternoon about that. But it's a problem we have to face. You've got to justify your choice of the name language for a language to be included. Because we claim that we're not including dialects. We're trying to simplify our lives by not including dialects. You can't simplify it all that easily. Additional bibliographic sources, especially new learning materials. People who are involved in revitalizing, campaigning for languages often like to point out to UNESCO that some new teaching materials, learning materials are being made available. This is all useful information. We don't want to throw it away, and we want to make good use of it if we can. So we try and make room for it in the tabs of data on the language. personal anecdotes about contact or identification with the speakers. We sometimes get people saying, my grandma used to speak this language. I wondered what had become of it. Something, a personal anecdote, which is all very interesting and deserves a reply, but probably won't make much difference to the atlas itself. And then there's the knotty question of ethno-political policy statements. Representatives of minorities that are struggling for greater recognition of their rights will often put their case forward to UNESCO. And why shouldn't they? It's the United Nations body. They would probably want an ally, a referee, in their struggle for recognition of their language rights. I can't blame them, although it's a bit hard to turn a policy statement into something that you can actually concretely summarize in an atlas. But if we see some nugget of factual information that should be included in a policy statement, then obviously we will. And grassroots movements should be acknowledged, of course, to protect and foster languages. And then, of course, there's general questions about UNESCO criteria, about what makes us do what we do, how we choose the criteria we have. So how do we deal with this feedback? The Foundation for Endangered Languages, taking on the role of processing the feedback and adapting it for future use, it appointed a set of regional consultants. And broadly speaking, they're the same, more or less the same team, with a few variations, as those who edited each section of the atlas. We simply asked the editors, would you like to be involved in monitoring what you've already done, the reaction to what you've already done? Most of them said yes, for obvious reasons. So what we have to remember here is that the online and the print versions of the atlas are not merely two identical manifestations of the same thing. And here lies a bit of a problem. They do have a qualitative difference. On the one hand, there is the text accompanying the maps in that you see in the online version. On the other, the data on each language is more extensive in the online version. I explained about the pop-up tabs. Obviously, you can't do that here in something printed. But what you do have instead is this in the printed version, which you don't have in the online version. You have a detailed description of the language situation in each continent, written by the expert editor who provided the maps. Now, you can't find this text in the online version. So in other words, we're parceling out the information in different ways in each of the two versions. This is just UNESCO policy. It's not my policy. Partly to do with, when people ask about it, the UNESCO's official answer is that we wouldn't want the print version to be redundant. It could be redundant otherwise. And also, I suppose, there's the assumption that you wouldn't want to read through a mass of text on a screen when you're really only trying to home in on one particular language. The kind of person, kind of user that is assumed to be using this is focusing on a particular language interest of theirs rather than an overall situation. Now, you could argue for or against that, but that's basically the UNESCO reasoning behind having these two different versions. This is the first time we've done these two different versions, so I wouldn't say that the policy is set in stone, but that's the way it is at the moment. So, where does that leave us? Those who make comments on the data on individual languages on the online version, they're approving, disapproving, or correcting information that's unique to that edition, but without the benefit of a contextual review of the whole region and its endangered languages. So if their question is about how, say, Manx fits into the general pattern of European languages and comparing it with others, then that's something, a situation where they would actually benefit from reading the text in the chapter on Europe, for instance. And they're encouraged to go out and buy this. So, those who have the static printed version, which must await another edition to be amended, we're hoping, of course, that in the general run of events, there's going to be another one soon. are able to read the accompanying text about each region, and so that some of the more general questions that would not be asked by online users if they were aware of the context and the criteria used for including certain languages and excluding others, and for considering language varieties within what might be considered a dialect continuum, which is always a problem. So I said earlier that it's been the policy not to include dialects if the variety is undisputed as a dialect. Some complaints have concerned overzealous splitting of a set of varieties into separate languages. But so often, since endangered languages tend to be precisely those that are not standardized, not codified, they occur in a continuum where the speakers at one end can't comprehend speakers at the other. If you can imagine situations like that in the world. Like, for instance, Quechua in the Andes in South America. Some varieties of Quechua are not intelligible to others, to speakers of others. All of them are not standard within, not official within the country where they live, so they thrive in their own diversity, if you can see what I mean. So the question about additional bibliographic material is something we encourage, but we like the sources to be as primary as possible. So, for instance, Wikipedia. People often quote Wikipedia as a source of information about a language. Sometimes it seems to be almost the only source, because, you know what, I'm sure you know what Wikipedia is like. It's a democratic encyclopedia medium, so to speak. We've recently had to make a ruling about this because so many people were writing in to UNESCO on our feedback forms saying Wikipedia source says such and such. They're coming in thick and fast. We're starting to be drowned in Wikipedia articles in the bibliography. Of course, those things in themselves have bibliographies themselves, and they often include articles that would be really useful. Why not include those? I think we should encourage that. So I'm not saying that Wikipedia is a bad thing. I'm just saying that we have to sift our sources. It's a democratic medium with the freedom to edit available to anybody. And when you think about it, UNESCO can't afford to be so democratic and invite direct amendment of entries by users, because we can't. In the online version, we're still experimenting with continuous editing. In the printed version, we're obviously not. So we're not comparing like with like sources of information. In fact, each suggested amendment goes through quite an elaborate validation process. When I get back from this visit, I've got to validate a couple of new languages that are now going to appear on this atlas, because we've put them to various tests and decided they qualify as endangered languages, and we were ignoring them. So first it's passed on to the relevant regional consultant editor, who may or may not recommend further action. Their recommendations are then passed back to me and my assistant when I had one, although I don't have an assistant at the moment. And we pass the signal for final validation onto UNESCO, usually in the form of words chosen by the consultant. So that by the consultant, I mean the regional editor, in effect. So this work's going on in a slow and orderly way. The wheels of the United Nations grind slowly but firmly. I have to tell you that the work in revising the Atlas started off with a sudden jolt as soon as the online edition was released back in February 2009. The controversy started immediately, and it came from here in the British Isles, although the launch was at the UNESCO headquarters in Paris. And since then, most of the controversies about this atlas have been about languages in Western Europe, in fact. Specifically, the objections came from activists for the Cornish and Manx languages, which our European regional editor had labelled extinct. So here I've got to grab the bull by the horns. I've already shown you the levels of endangerment that this edition had taken over without changing them from the two previous editions. And I soon realised that at the more critical end, the gradations are something of a blunt instrument for hitting languages with. You're probably aware of the language situations in Cornwall. I'm sure you are on the Isle of Man. I'm sure you will have heard the story that the last native speaker of Cornish as a first language is supposed to have been Dolly Pentreath, who died in 1777. That's the accepted story. There were rumours of isolated cases of tiny numbers of speakers surviving into the 19th century. In the case of the Isle of Man, I don't need to tell you. We're here in Ned Maddrell's name, and he died in 1974, known to be the last native-born speaker. Both of these languages have been codified, written down with long, traceable written histories. It makes them revivable. It makes them, it can put them on a sure footing in revitalizing them. There are guardians of these languages. I like to think they're sitting here in front of me in this room, and they're proud and jealous defenders of them, and I'm happy to be among them. So there followed a discussion between our regional editors and our commissioning editors at UNESCO and myself, and we resolved that two new categories should be given: revitalized and revived. Now briefly, the difference between these two categories, after a long discussion, quite a heated discussion, is that a revived language is one which is actually brought back from the dead and is now being taught to second language heritage speakers, whereas a revitalized language is one that has been brought back perhaps from the brink of death through some project that increases the number of native speakers, and most importantly, the domains in which it's used. I can think of some examples in maybe Central America where that's happening. But not only at the more critical end is there controversy, they're also at the other end of the telescope, where a language is deemed to be vulnerable. This white area here, that kind of symbol, can also be controversial. Like with the more extreme cases of endangerment, so the less extreme cases, they cause debate. They also tended to be centred on Europe. A good case in point is Bavarian. Now, Bavarian is included in the atlas to represent that distinct variety of German spoken in the south. I'm sure some of you have heard it, not obviously different from standard German. I'm thinking of the area around Munich and on into Austria. We've had expressions of outrage from users, that not that Bavarian is recognised as a separate language, they're fine with that, but that it's considered to be in any danger at all. What's it doing in there? Let me quote from the editor of the European section in this accompanying text. What he said was, German consists of Thuringian, Upper Saxon and Silesian, and so that not only Low Saxon but also Limburgian, Ripuarian, Moselle Franconian, which also covers Luxembourgish, Rhenish Franconian and East Franconian, as well as Alemannic and Bavarian are recognised as regional languages. None of the regional languages are particularly endangered, but they all continue to be spoken in a diglossic situation with the national languages. In other words, people switch between the two depending on who they're talking to, whether they're talking to officials or their neighbours, their family. So, complicated situation in Germany. Among languages spilling over the border of Germany, of course, the German-speaking lands, let's say. Notice I used the phrase regional languages. The atlas doesn't use the term variety or dialect here. I don't want to get bogged down in a discussion of the differences between language and dialect here, but the question does inevitably arise. It's difficult to apply an apparently objective criterion like percentage of mutual intelligibility. In other words, you could do a objective percentage study of how many words are in common between two varieties. It's too emotive an issue to just leave it at that. As in the case of Germany, or in the case of Italy or France, where a diglossic situation exists with a national language. When you think Italian is actually a fairly young language, Italy is a fairly young, unified nation, well, so is Germany for that matter. So standardization is a young process, and there's lots and lots of forces acting against that. So the comments from users about the German situation have been couched in more emotive terms than that, and they have to do with the domains of use and number of speakers. Our regional editors point in including these languages at the vulnerable end of the scale, that white end of the scale, is that those domains and numbers are showing signs of shrinking, under pressure from a central standardizing and homogenizing influence. So, is it a badge of honor to be, for a language to be included in the atlas? Well, I don't know, but national governments or national commissions of UNESCO have not been lodging complaints with our team. We don't get outraged, indignant comments from, you know, the official representatives of countries at UNESCO. No, it comes from the grassroots, the comments we get. The institutional comments have come rarely, and when they have, they've been from grassroots organisations trying to promote a language that's included in the atlas. And since they are bottom-up organisations, they welcome this wake-up call to national governments that's implied in the atlas. Because that's why we're doing it, really. That's why we're doing this at all. It's not for me to say whether a representative of a government policy in any particular country is going to be horrified at seeing so many or so few languages mapped in the map of their country. It's not for me to say, but I'd like to think that they react, that they think that it's got an implication for them, to take measures to safeguard the languages that are shown, even if they're only white or yellow. Comments from users have not come uniformly from all over the world, and I wonder why. There's a definite preponderance of comments from Europe and about European languages. Quite a few also concern languages of Southern and Southeast Asia and South America. Relatively little has come about North American indigenous languages, and practically none at all about West Africa or China. Despite the large number of endangered languages, look at West Africa here. We've had to even do an inset. Look at China here. Quite a few, a fair few endangered languages logged there. Why no reaction? What conclusions are we, the editorial team, supposed to draw? Does it mean simply that our European editor tends to split hairs and divide up language varieties more finely than the rest do? Well, as users of Manx, you've been hit with the other end of the blunt instrument, so I don't think you'd agree that they are. That's one possibility, but it doesn't explain everything. Does it mean that comments come only from academics and computer literate communities with easy access to the internet and fluency in the languages in which we operate? English, French and Spanish. Those are the languages in which this atlas has appeared in print. Also online, by the way, French and Spanish. And I've just heard in the last couple of days, just before I came away here, that there's negotiations underway for Chinese, possibly Russian, possibly Arabic and possibly Portuguese versions. The talks are all in the early stages and all at different levels. It's too early to tell you now, and I can't tell you anything official. But it's going to mean a difference, isn't it? If they're available online, it's going to make a difference to the kind and quality of comments that we get about different areas of the world. So, we have had comments in other major languages of Europe too, but none in languages from outside Europe. That's another very plausible possibility. Does it say something about the whole concept of endangerment? I wonder if the whole problem of the uneven use of the atlas has got to do with the idea of endangerment. Possibly that. I'm just theorising here. Is endangerment still largely a white man's concept? Which is not so important in languages which are multilingual anyway, in societies that are multilingual anyway. A country like Papua New Guinea, where, well, let's take a look at Papua New Guinea. Yes, there are some endangered languages there, none of them in very dark colours, because they're all small, there are hundreds of them, and they're all coexisting on a fairly equal basis. Yes, there is some endangerment there, but not as much as you might think, compared with other parts of the world. I'm taking Papua New Guinea just out of thin air as an example, but Is endangerment a white man's concept? I wonder. I wonder. If you're used to a hierarchy of languages in different domains of life, why should you try to see a reason to subvert or overthrow that hierarchy? Why not just live with it and accept it? The Darwinian approach. I mean, if you have to theorize that much about it. It's the natural order, after all. So, to sum up these possible reasons, and I'm just throwing some ideas at you here, I don't know the answers. I think the overall pattern of feedback to the atlas is not very surprising. There's another factor I should add, the fact that these online users have not had access to the accompanying text, so they won't have been able to read the background reasoning behind it. I can see that this is sometimes a serious disadvantage, especially where the criticism of our team's underlying criteria for including a language are involved. The users see the result, but not the reasoning that led to the inclusion of a language. So, what about newly discovered languages? Are we likely to discover anything new and revolutionary? Isn't the world completely covered? It would be nice to report to you that the consultants have brought to light some totally new discoveries, blinking into the daylight. Well, yes and no. They have and they haven't. You might have even heard, if you follow the linguistic press or just the ordinary newspaper reports about newly discovered languages or languages on the point of extinction. For instance, last year, the Living Tongues Institute gave some publicity to the discovery of a language in northeast India called Koro, K-O-R-O. This turned out to be not so much a new discovery as a reclassification. So they weren't people who'd never been seen before. That's not what we're talking about. It only goes to show how little documented so many of the languages are. It was simply misidentification of a language. Wrongly subdivided is what we're talking about here. And so, by the same token, we can make a similar claim. Matthias Brensinger, who's actually the consultant editor for Sub-Saharan Africa, but he has a great interest in Japan and Korea. He made the discovery that the language of the island of Jeju, off the coast of South Korea, is substantially different to standard Korean. Now, you won't see the fact registered here, but I'm talking about this island here, which if you're in the back row, you haven't got a chance of seeing. It's where my finger is. Tiny island about the size of the Isle of Man, off the coast of South Korea. And the language is definitely shrinking in its usage. So we've announced and made an amendment to our atlas, and we now have one endangered language of the otherwise homogeneous Korean peninsula. Korea is just blank here, just the land of Korea, the one language, not endangered at all. Now we have a little spot. Korean's a very well documented language, and so are most of its varieties. And Jeju is not an isolated island cut off from the world. It has its own university. The important thing here is the relative status towards the national language. It wasn't officially acknowledged even in Korea. So in a way we can sort of, I don't like to be controversial here, but you can blame a sort of conspiracy of Korean academics for giving a low profile to Jeju, which in every other sense is a very distinct language. And we got lots of evidence that it is. We got sort of testimonies before we made up our minds finally on that issue, and we admitted we'd been wrong. So it's a regional language with as much claim to a distinct identity as Bavarian in Germany or Veneton in Italy. So far we've actually logged 4 new languages in those 2 years, 4 completely new cases. And of course, we'd known that the people exist, we'd known that the speakers exist, we just hadn't acknowledged what they were speaking as a distinct variety. So this atlas is now an ongoing project as long as UNESCO has the means to support it. Within the UN organization, Endangered Languages is now a separate section from Intangible Heritage, which was the body that oversaw the first 2 editions and even this one to begin with. What future developments would I like to see? Are we going okay for time?
Yeah, just a couple of minutes and then
Yeah, I've nearly finished. All right. Briefly, that both forms of the atlas continue, the print form and the online form, but with more convergence so that the online users can read the text and the reasoning and theory behind our choices. That users will continue to take an active and critical interest in improving the atlas, and most important of all, that we as a team of editorial consultant linguists will be able to continue perfecting it. So I've come to the Isle of Man not just to inform you about the atlas and its workings, but also to learn. And the wonderful thing about this atlas, I find, is the challenging reactions to it. I first discovered this soon after it was published, not only in the jolt I had about the reaction from champions of Cornish and Manx, but also when I was invited to take part in the annual festival or jornadas of the Aragonese-speaking people in the Aragon region of Spain, the area around Saragossa, which has its own distinct language. The Aragonese language's position in the atlas was not being disputed, it is there. They were just seeing it as an important sign of recognition for the language. I guess you could say it was a political move, but it was heartening anyway to see that. I was impressed with the well-organised movement to keep Aragonese alive, just as I am impressed here on the Isle of Man in my limited experience of seeing how well-organised the fostering of Manx is, that it seems to be in good, safe hands. In many European countries, similar movements are taking place. And here on the Isle of Man, I've had a chance to see revitalisation efforts that are bearing fruit. I hope to see some more before I leave. And they deserve recognition in the UNESCO Atlas too. So I think you deserve to give yourselves a round of applause, all of you who are supporting the future of the Manx language. I could just say briefly that if you're interested in the Foundation for Endangered Languages that I've mentioned, there are a few copies of brochures, not enough for all of you, that I've brought about the Foundation here on the front table, and also just as many as I could fit in my bag, copies of our latest newsletter, Ogmios. But I think I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer questions. I'll just grab a glass of water.